everybody. My name is Dr. Agnieszka Hechniu. I work at the University of Exeter in the UK. It's my great pleasure, and thank you very much for the organizers for allowing me to chair this exquisite panel of experts. I am very privileged to be doing that. So I will really cut my comments to the very minimum. I'd like to say you do have biographies of our speakers in your packs. Please refer to that. And we are looking forward to hear from our panelists. There is a slight change in the order for the presentations. We'll start with hearing more from John. Then we'll follow up with comments from Randy, who will sort of take us between operational and legal aspects. Following to that, we'll hear from Daniel, more on legal side of matters and challenges. And then to all of that, we'll hear from Daphne herself responding to the presentations, but also in relation to discussion and analysis she provided us in chapter 7 of her book. So if you do have a book, please do refer to that. We're going to talk about presence of civilians in urban underground warfare context. Thank you, and John, your floor.
Hello again. If I repeat myself, so be it. I had to mix two presentations into one. I will murder history again, so that's a consistent theme. But so this is a little bit more into my realm of, I am a urban warfare student. I wouldn't even say scholar. I study urban warfare as much detail as I can, and I have a dream job, but that's the only thing I do. In understanding the coming together of urban and underground, you cannot study urban warfare and quickly realize that there's no separation between urban warfare and underground warfare. If you have an urban location defined by a lot of people on a geographical location with build-up sites and infrastructure to support those people, it's called the urban triad, that infrastructure will include the underground, whether it's an underground sewer, a water line, transportation. Not all cities have that, but most of them have some component of the underground. It's just a part. Whether you're talking ancient Roman aqueducts, catacombs under European cities, carezes in urban sites to transport potable water in, bad water out, all of it. I am an urban warfare specialist, so I tell you places in urban sites where there has been conflict, whether it's an internationally recognized conflict, civil disturbances that rise to a level of revolution, all of that. You're still not going to separate that there's always an underground component to it. Now, we don't always, and that's what I told you, the biggest challenge of all is getting the people who make the right decisions and investments to realize that it is such a problem that we need to spend time preparing for it rather than adapting to it. So again, I wanted to start off with just murdering history a little bit and understanding why the resurgence of urban and underground warfare. Yes. Underground warfare, it goes back to the beginning of warfare. It is a natural phenomenon that happens in an asymmetric conflict, that it is a significant advantage to a weaker force to then go underground. Whether that's because you have a massing army that fills your city and you want to resort to guerrilla tactics, whether that's there are incoming highly explosive weapons and you want to go underground to negate those effects. You just want to move without being seen. Across time, it is historical that the weaker force or defending force will go underground. And I talked about this morning, this is my murder of history. Yes, I can point to underground warfare across time, but it has had its ups and its downs in the sine wave of warfare, and that's what we're seeing is the resurgence of the commonality or the frequent use of it. I can point to all kinds of urban warfare or underground components of urban warfare, but the amount that we're seeing now, like I said, warfare started in cities, fortifications were built, the evolution of siege warfare started, artillery negated that, Underground had a major component of all that. Now that you go out and meet the Army, if you have a military, didn't matter, you still had the asymmetric advantage was to go underground into the cities. And then you have the age of the ISR, or the precision-guided munition, which I'll talk about a little bit in a more. I can say as an urban warfare scholar that most militaries do not have a long history of urban warfare. They have a long history of fighting for cities, not in cities. That has changed. Yes, I can take you to any battle. I can take you to historical battles and show you that there's fighting in cities. But if I look at overall qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis, most militaries do not have experience fighting in cities and definitely under cities. That has changed. And that's why I showed the amount of tunnel bombs just from 2014 to 2015. Now let's talk about just the nature of conflict in the last 5 years. They are sieges. So I can point to 9 different multi-year battles that have happened in Iraq, Syria, the Ukraine, and the Philippines. And all 9 of them lasted more than 9 months, and they were all sieges, where somebody has embedded themselves in urban terrain and said, come get me out. And in every one of those 9 sieges, there has been a major underground component of it. And I don't know how to stress major, but I know Dr. Richmond, I mean, she's really tried to get the attention on this topic. As an urban warfare scholar and somebody who studies the fighting in cities, why has warfare evolved to cities? A separate topic. I could spend another 15 to 30 minutes for you. I was told to focus on the underground component of that. Cities provide anybody, whoever gets there, that's another conversation, ready-made military capability. Every building can be turned into a bunker. Most buildings have an underground component of it, which then gives them an advantage of a bunkerized location. And that leads to what's warfare today. In those 9 sieges that I talked about, most of them resulted in the destruction of the city in itself because of what's called there's a writer named Amos Fox who calls it the precision paradox. Most would believe for urban combat you just need to get more precise in your weapons, develop that can target buildings at discretion and with proportionality, distinction, all the laws that we're going to talk about. The precision paradox is this. If I'm in a city, if there isn't already a connection underground, I will make connections underground. And that's what we've seen in the last 5 years of all 9 of these sieges. If there isn't already a tunnel between the buildings, I will dig another tunnel. So that way when you come to get me, no matter what military you are, no matter what advanced technologies you have, where I know I can target a building and I can put a guided munition into a window of a certain floor. It's not precision unless you have the effects on the enemy that you wanted to have. So what you're seeing in these battles in warfare today, yes, we have to remember history, but in the trend of warfare today is embed yourself into the cities. You used to call it hugging, for a military would hug another military so that way they could not call fire on themselves. What you're seeing today is, whether it's non-state actor or proxy force, hugging civilians in urban areas. So if I hug civilians in an urban area, that causes the attacker to have to go through a different decision matrix. The precision paradox is if I can get myself into urban terrain, connect all the pieces of urban terrain, doesn't matter if you drop a $500,000 precision guided munition on the building that I am in, if you catch me, I am just going to, when you bomb it, move underground to the next building. And that's what we've seen in it today. And I would call that the precision paradox because it's precision guided munitions, but you did not get the person you were trying to get. Right now we can't see through buildings, so they're filled them with civilians. And I think we'll cover this, and I'm no lawyer, but the responsibility to ensure that there are no civilian casualties, whether it's in a building or in the tunnel that you found, is complex, especially for ground forces. Whenever you look at fighting in cities, like I said, the history of whatever military you're talking about, every military is going to go in with built-in assumptions on the way that they're going to fight the future. We call that force design. I've studied the U.S. military in detail. Usually when you design a military to do something, you do these giant war games. And they're based on the biggest threat in the most likely environment you think you're going to fight that in. And then you design and invest in your military against that, whether it's homeland defense, expeditionary, state-on-state warfare. Those designs, I can tell you from most militaries, do not involve high-intensity combat in cities or underground, because there's the principle of avoiding void and bypass. It used to say that for urban, in our urban doctrine, the U.S. used to say that, avoid and bypass. In the most recent underground warfare doctrine of the U.S. military, it says the subterranean is high risk, avoid at all costs. Well, if I just told you that all warfare of today, the last 5 years, is happening in urban areas, your ability to avoid the subterranean as a military is gone. So that can be a planning assumption, all that we want, but it's a reality of today. Yes, it has historical foundations, and it's almost like history is repeating itself. It just, the trend of this is, we're now on the up curve of who we're fighting against and what environments. It is now at the advantage of a weaker force to pull themselves into urban areas and to go underground. I want to talk about the Underminer project because Daphne mentioned it. So one of the organizations in the United States, DARPA, most people, again, most military's assumptions for underground is about offensive. I'm going to seize an urban area and the underground might be a challenge. Not many people look at it from a defensive aspect, as in I will have to use the underground in order to do just what the enemy is doing to me. Say you're fighting another peer military and they're approaching you and you want to go underground. It's not in the U.S. doctrine, but DARPA had started this thing called the Underminer program, and they have multiple projects. And I love it because I have 3 small kids, so it's named after the Incredibles Underminer. It was a call out for rapid tunneling. Because right now, and Elon Musk is pretty big on this, is doing the same thing, trying to discover faster ways to dig tunnels. We view, it's important to know, because one, I think it's really cool to think of if the city is such an advantage to the enemy, one of the reasons is because of all the assumptions I go in with it. I usually think about 2D, I only think about ground, so I'm going to come at that enemy across the ground, because usually they'll have assets to prevent aerial assets from landing troops, or it's just too high a risk. Rarely do we think about digging our own tunnel, just like the sappers did of ancient warfare, to go under that urban defense, such as Mosul, that was prepared for 2 years. They prepared the urban defense, and we did not think about going under all that. I think the Underminer is cool. My last bit is about some of the conversation here is, again, if you understand how military, since I'm the military guy, the guy that studies military, there's an assumption of adaptability, no matter what. You can design, usually there's one thing in history that resonates true, is no matter how much you plan for something, that's not what's going to happen. It's intelligent. There's a joke about intelligence. All militaries are expected to be able to, they're trained, organized, and equipped for one fight in a certain location against a certain enemy. And then they'll be used in 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different locations. And they are designed supposed to be adaptable to that. That's the way we've always treated the underground. Adapt to it if found, avoid, or adapt. So the problem is that what do we provide people to help them adapt? And I try not to stay at the tactical level, but just because of my background, I'm often pushed down there. There's a difference between adapting versus preparing. The U.S. military had no underground warfare, and they have made leaps and bounds, had no underground warfare school, so training. They've made leaps and bounds, and they're getting ready to start since the Vietnam War. In the academic community, this is where I think one of the most important things will come in here. If I want to research underground warfare, I am unaware of a annotated bibliography for that, other than read Daphne's book. I am unaware of an underground warfare data set. I know there's not even one for urban, but to say across, let's say the last 5 years, I told you about the 45 tunnel bombs. Well, how many other instances are recorded of underground warfare, and where can I go to get that in order to do quantitative or qualitative analysis? There's no repository of first-hand accounts. We've, luckily, because Daphne, or Dr. Reisner has been working on it for so long, has reached out and tried to find those first-hand accounts, because they're important on when reality meets the road. But there's no repository. There's no center for the study of underground warfare. When you really dig down to how are we helping people adapt? If you're from the humanitarian community, what case studies are there currently that could be used to assist people in going through the complex legal aspects of a soldier finding a tunnel, and then what can he do about it? Case studies, I can't find any written case studies that would help you with that. So I'll end with, there's a lot of work to be done.
Just a minute, yeah, we're going to call up a slide. Sorry about that. No, it's not. Just, there we go. It's good. First of all, thank you to the host for hosting this conference. I'll tell you up front, my background has been more in urban warfare. But as John just mentioned, you really can't think about urban warfare without also discussing subterranean warfare. While subterranean warfare certainly takes place in rule settings in modern cities, by their very design, they contain enormous subterranean spaces. From sewers to subways to utility conduits, cities are full of subterranean spaces. In cities, there can be miles of pre-existing tunnels. For example, in New York City, there are over 400 miles of underground subway tunnels. Buildings in cities often have multiple layers of basements and subfloors, which can be connected by utility conduits and other access tunnels. There are pedestrian tunnels that connect buildings that allow people to avoid traffic, harsh weather. There are roads that pass under cities that can sometimes extend for miles. Underground utility conduits and sewers can be large enough for people to traverse standing up. And in some cities, such as Montreal, there seems to be a second city below the first. In open terrain fighting, ground forces primarily operate on a horizontal plane. Battlefields are two-dimensional, having width and depth. But in subterranean fighting, and in urban warfare in general, the dimension of height is added to width and depth, making the fighting three-dimensional even for ground forces. Subterranean warfare and urban warfare are also connected because many of the unique aspects of subterranean warfare are mirrored above ground, with the spaces below ground seemingly a reflection of the space above. Blind turns in halls above ground are similar to blind turns in tunnels. Stairs and elevator shafts provide access both to above ground and below ground. Tunnels connecting buildings underground, while sky bridges create tunnels above ground. Fighters make tunnels underground by digging, while tunnels are made above ground by making mouse holes in the walls of connecting buildings. Multi-story buildings allow fighters three-dimensional fighting above ground, while subterranean war floors allow for below ground. In most cases, layered over this already complex terrain is an extremely dense civilian population, many of which will not be able to flee the fighting. Several of the legal aspects and challenges of urban warfare, are both below and above ground, are currently the subject of ongoing debates. These include, should certain urban subterranean objects receive heightened protection because they are necessary to the survival of the civilian population? When considering proportionality, what must be considered as harm to civilians? For example, should a commander be expected to foresee and account for the second and third order effects of destruction of subterranean targets? And how much does civilian use of an object factor into proportionality when striking dual use targets? In considering distinction, what level of certainty is required, including is there a presumption, as stated in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, that unknown people must be considered civilians? In limiting unnecessary suffering, should we consider certain banned methods of warfare, such as the use of tear gas, as a more humane way of clearing underground spaces? Finally, should there be a ban on wide area explosive weapons in urban warfare? And if so, how would that impact the warfighter's ability to strike subterranean targets? Additional Protocol 1, as well as customary law, states that military objects are those objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offer a definite military advantage. In the context of subterranean objects, sub-objects may be military objects by their nature, such as underground military facilities and tunnels dug exclusively for military use. However, in cities, most will not be exclusive for military use. Even when they're created for exclusive military use, the layered nature of urban subterranean objects means that military objects may sit above or below civilian objects, creating unique collateral damage issues for the commander. Subways and underground retail space, utility conduits, and sewers are generally civilian objects. But if they're used by fighters, they may be considered military objects during the time they're used by fighters. While dual-use considerations often do not exist for targets based on nature, dual use generally is a consideration for targets based on use, location, or purpose. The impact on civilian, if these objects are damaged or destroyed, must be considered before targeting them. For example, would a group of fighters using a utility conduit to traverse the city, while the conduit may be a military object during the time the fighters are using it, the impact on the civilian population must be considered before deciding to destroy it. Protection of civilians and their property is also built into the principle of proportionality. But just how much must the reverberating effects of an attack be considered is still being debated. With dual use targets, the military use makes them a legitimate target, but their civilian use requires that the attacking party to consider the impact, damage, or destruction of this property will have on civilians. In an urban environment, the impact to civilians may quickly become excessive. Further complicating this issue is that applying the principle of proportionality and distinction in urban subterranean situations can be particularly challenging. Given that the reason many urban subterranean objects exist in cities is to keep them out of sight, determining the impact on civilians may be difficult. And even when there isn't a deliberate goal to hide subterranean objects, just the fact that they're below ground restricts their detection by sight and many of our above-ground sensors. Additionally, when there is fighting above ground, civilians often seek shelter in subterranean objects that they would normally not use. For example, sewers, drainage pipes may be places that civilians go to avoid fighting above ground. This means that military commanders cannot simply assume these objects will not have civilians located in them. History is replete with examples of urban fighting where civilians took shelter in catacombs, sewers, subway tunnels, and other objects, to the point where commanders should probably presume that civilians are in these structures rather than presuming they're not. This is one area where Additional Protocol 1 and the U.S. approach diverges on the presumption of being a civilian. Additional Protocol 1 and Article 50 states that in the case of doubt of whether a person is civilian, that person shall be considered a civilian. The U.S. Department of Defense Law War Manual makes it clear that the U.S. does not agree with this presumption. It states that the legal presumption of civilian status in cases of doubt may be determined at a degree of certainty that would not account for the realities of war, and that in assessing whether a person or object that normally does not have a military purpose or use is a military objective, commanders must and other decision makers must make the decision in good faith based on information available to them in light of the circumstances ruling at the time. This arguably makes it easier for U.S. commander to order attack on a subterranean object, such as a subway station, when the commander knows that there's fighters present, but is uncertain if all people present are fighters. AP1 requires the commanders to presume that the unknown people to be civilians. The U.S. interpretation provides some leeway based on the circumstances for commanders to determine that they're not. And proportionality doesn't just stop with considering the impact to civilians themselves. It also considers the impact on civilian objects. For example, if fighters use a subway tunnel during hours when the trains are not operating, the use of the tunnel by fighters would make it a military object for such time they were using it. However, it would still be a dual-use target because civilians also use the tunnel. Assuming the attack could be ordered at a time of day when civilians are not using the tunnel, proportionality still requires that an attack on the tunnel, before it can be ordered, the commander must consider the impact damaging and destroying the tunnel would have on the civilian population. Additionally, when considering proportionality in subterranean fighting, there are several factors that increase the potential harm to civilians and civilian objects. The first is population density. With thousands, if not millions of people living in cities, the impact on the civilian property of destruction of any civilian property, especially public services, is magnified significantly. The second is dependency on public services. Unlike in a rural setting, in modern cities, transportation, sewer, water, heat, electric, even ventilation to underground spaces are completely dependent upon municipal systems. Typically, lines for these critical services are located in underground conduits. Unfortunately, at the same time that damage or destruction of these systems has a greater significance on the impact in urban settings, these pre-existing tunnels are extremely tempting for fighters who wish to move about the city undetected. Third is structural integrity. With so many subterranean objects located under cities, often in layers, their destruction can have a significant impact on the structures above them. While collapsing a tunnel under a suburban home may affect one family, collapsing a tunnel under a multi-story apartment may impact hundreds of families. Destroying several basement levels of a skyscraper may collapse the entire building. Fourth is a financial loss. Destroying a tunnel in a rural area may have little financial impact, even if a single-family home is destroyed above it. But the financial impact of destroying a subway tunnel in a city could easily result in billions of dollars of damage. Subterranean construction in urban areas is extremely expensive, and add in the structural damage that may be done to streets and buildings above it, and the cost quickly becomes astronomical. These factors will often dictate a more precise targeting approach to subterranean warfare. Rather than just destroying a sewer tunnel, military forces may be required to clear it. With current means and methods, this will likely mean that men and women entering the tunnel to physically clear them from enemy fighters. Close quarters combat has always resulted in higher casualties to fighters on both sides, especially in enclosed spaces with limited light, bad air, flooding, exposed electrical wires, and choke points that can be easily booby-trapped. As casualties mount in clearing operation, commanders will want to look for ways to eliminate the enemy without sending troops in. The U.S. Army is considering how to fight underground. In Army technical publication 3-21.51, Subterranean Objects, was published just last month, the U.S. Army addressed subterranean warfare. Part of the justification for this publication and the training of Army units is the acknowledgement that the next war may be fought in megacities, and they want soldiers to fight outside. They want soldiers to not just fight inside cities, but beneath them. While their efforts are admirable, this publication disappointingly missed the opportunity to educate on and account for the unique legal aspects of this type of fighting. In a publication, there is only one reference to legal considerations. It's found in a paragraph on contingency planning that lists examples for subterranean contingencies. In the list of considerations, it includes this bullet statement: combination of civilians and enemy combatants within underground facilities and associated rules of engagement implications. It provided no more detail or explanation for this statement. As this document is meant to be used to train military on how to fight in subterranean environments, failure to include a detailed discussion of legal considerations in the chapters on planning and targeting is, in my opinion, a major oversight. That said, I do believe there is still hope. The fact that some countries are thinking about and planning for subterranean fight is a major step. And having documents such as this publication and the conferences we're at today help raise awareness and our first steps in moving the ball forward in this area. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Reisner. For those of you who don't know me, I was a long-serving Israeli military officer, and I was the head of the Israeli Army's International Law Department for 10 years. And I also spent 20 years of my life as the Israeli government's lawyer and negotiator for the peace process. So I'm not really good at what I do, so I apologize for everything I'll say coming up now. When Daphne told me that she was writing this book several years ago, I said, I love the idea, but do you have enough things to write in this subject? Because, you know, it sounds like a niche within a niche. Having read the book, boy, was I wrong. And I actually, only when I read the book did I realize how many issues arise in subterranean conflict that I'd never thought about until I read your book. But looking at the turnout at this conference, apparently I'm not the only one who's taking the issue much more seriously than they used to. Maybe it's because we're underground that everyone came, but given the fact that... So in the next 13 minutes, I want to address two parts. The first part I want to highlight, following on what Randy said, some of the questions which I have discovered about underground warfare in urban environments, which I wasn't ready for, and frankly, we don't have any answers to. And secondly, I want to go higher up and say, okay, given that is the situation, what are we supposed to be doing? Let me start with the weeds for a moment. The question I asked myself when I read the book and when I thought about it, how are tunnels different from buildings? Or are tunnels different from buildings? Because many of the things we have discussed here at the table also apply to a regular building going up. It can be full of civilians. You sometimes don't know who's in the building. It's very difficult to identify. You can't enter it without taking a risk. I mean, so is there any difference? And the answer is, in 90% of the cases, a tunnel is just another building. And the reality is, international law hasn't been really good at coming up with answers for buildings either. I'll give you some questions which I'm troubled with, which apply to buildings and tunnels at the same time. When does a tunnel become a military target, right? I mean, for Israel, that's almost the first question. Daphne in the book writes correctly, building a tunnel is not even a violation of anything. You're allowed to build a tunnel. So am I supposed to identify which agency is building the tunnel so I know if it's a military tunnel or if it's a sewer tunnel, right? Because only through that mechanism can I know if it's a military installation or if it's a civilian installation which can be later abused. If it's a military installation, it's a legitimate target from day one. If it's a civilian installation, it becomes much more complicated. But that applies to buildings as well. So in that respect, the question remains the same, but the dilemma is no different. Are there specific types of tunnels which are inherently targetable? And the converse, are there specific types of tunnels which you can never target? I'll give you an example. Someone establishes an underground hospital. I'm not thinking specifically of Gaza, but you know what I'm talking about. But so they've made it, in practice, immune to attack because we are unwilling to suffer the public opinion, International Criminal Court, and other price of destroying that hospital and everyone in it. But from a legal perspective, by the way, it's a legitimate military target, right? So that applies to a building, it could apply to a tunnel. It's the same dilemma. If there was a sewage tunnel with dangerous sewage, would that be immune to attack because of other rules of international law? Well, the same would be true for an above-ground depository of such material. So again, I don't see the difference. I'll move to the issue of the lawyers, we call it DPH, taking direct part in hostilities. When does a civilian become a legitimate target? When they take a direct part in hostilities. Is there something unique about tunnels relating to civilians in them? I argue no. Because if a civilian is digging a tunnel, if he's working for the military, it's a military tunnel he's building. He's like a civilian contractor building a military building, right? So in my eyes, at that point in time, he becomes a military target. There are international lawyers, by the way, who argue that civilian contractors building military facilities are not military targets. We have been fighting for 35 years. We have no answer to that one yet. It doesn't matter, but I still didn't see the difference between the two situations. I'll move to proportionality. Randy mentioned proportionality. This is the most difficult question in the laws of armed conflict, proportionality. I've been doing this for 35 years. I have no idea how to apply proportionality, and I'm supposed to be an expert. So, yeah, no, not for this one. So here's the question, and this is where tunnel warfare suddenly became more interesting. The reason it is difficult to carry out proportionality calculations in warfare is that the formula is stupid. Because the formula for proportionality is you're balancing between anticipated military advantage and anticipated civilian damage and casualties. This is the ultimate apples and oranges equation because they're not using the same numbers. How do you count people? How do you count military advantage? What does outweigh mean? There's no way to answer any of these questions, so all of us invent a mechanism to answer which has nothing to do with the rule. But all of it assumes that you have information. And the thing which makes tunnels different from buildings is that tunnels are inherently even more difficult to collect information about them than buildings are. There is technology out there right now which enables you to look into buildings from the outside. It took us a few years to develop. The US always developed before us, so we came in second or third, depending if you count the Germans. But the bottom line of the story is today, militaries have the capability to see through walls, and it's no longer a secret. We cannot see underground yet. It's more complicated. So the reality is we can, by using hit signatures and other forms of technology, we have decreased the level of doubt with respect to buildings. We have no capability of knowing what's in a tunnel unless we, A, go inside personally or through a robot or something else, or B, blow it up and count the bodies. And there's nothing, or use an agent who will tell us, etc. All of these are high-profile, high-risk, high-technology mechanisms. In other words, the first thing I suddenly realized which makes tunnels different from buildings is that they are stealth. Now, not all tunnels are stealth tunnels. Some of the stories Randy told relate to tunnels everyone knows about. You can know who's in them. Those are not the ones I'm focused on. The one I'm focused on, and I'm not just using the Israeli story, are the tunnels you don't know where they are, and you don't know who's in there, and you have no way of finding out. Now, in your book, you mentioned the fact that one of the mechanisms used throughout history, modern history, to combat tunnels is to use random drilling or random explosives. Now, every time you use the word random next to an international lawyer, we start shaking because that doesn't sound lawful to us, right? So let me give you an example. Most of the leading militaries in the world have been working for the last 30 years on invisibility suits. We call them chameleon suits, etc., but DARPA has a project, the Chinese have a project, the Russians have a project. I won't say a word about Israel. We never have a project about anything. But the reality is everyone wants to be able to create the first invisible soldier on the battlefield, and some are getting very close. What will happen when we have invisible soldiers in the battlefield? What do you do? How do you respond to that threat? random shooting in the air every few seconds to try and kill someone, etc. So international law hasn't come up with an answer to this because we're not there yet. And for the same reason, international law has not come up with an answer what to do with tunnels because, and this is where I want to focus on the next steps. You see, tunnels are far from a new phenomenon. We've had them for thousands of years. They're as old as history, and you said, John, and I totally agree. We have had civilians in tunnels for just as long as we have had tunnels. You know what's unique about now? We didn't have international law tunnels and civilians at the same time. That's the only problem we have. If we throw international law out, we know how to handle tunnels. We'll find them and kill anything in them. It's us, the lawyers, who have come up and said, well, wait a minute, you can't do what the Americans did in Vietnam, and you can't do what people did in World War II, and you can't do what they did in the Middle Ages, and you can't do anything they did in the world in the past. You now have to go through 17 different calculations of proportionality, reasonableness, and other things before you decide what to do with the tunnel. And that is the problem we're facing. We have come up with a series of rules which are not adapted to the situation we find ourselves, which is there is a relatively medium cost. As Mickey said, it's not cheap, but it's strategically cheap. Mechanism for the weaker side to create a strategic threat. It's not existential, as you mentioned, but it's strategic, which causes the other side to do one of two things. Either be hit or create so much noise that they will, lose brownie points in the media opinion, etc. So what should we be doing? And now I'm going up to the sky. I'm forgetting the specific issues, not because I don't care about them, but because we don't have answers to any of these questions, so we shouldn't even try. So the first thing I want to remind us that international law, and frankly, this is something which I sometimes need to remind my students and my colleagues, was not written by God. It was invented by people like us, and as such, it's full of holes. And it's just as good as the people who wrote it. And when I say that, I mean international law has an incredible amount of mistakes and flaws in it, including the laws of armed conflict. So, when I looked at the questions Daphne raised in her book, and the ones I went through, and Randy went through, etc., and I realized one of two things. We either have no answer to the question, or even worse, we have bad answers to the question from international law. Now, when I say a bad answer in international law, I mean one of four things. Either it's an answer which creates an imbalance on the battlefield, giving an unfair advantage to one side. International law cannot do that, because if it does, it will be automatically violated. Two, if it's too easy to violate without any price to be paid. Again, those rules are never implemented. Three, if it's too complex for a military commander to make a quick decision on the battlefield. International law was not developed for people sitting in academia. It was not developed for people sitting even in headquarters. It was developed so that a reasonable military commander operating in the field will be able to make a quick decision, maybe with some advice, on what am I allowed and not allowed to do. If it's too complicated for that, it's bad law. And the fourth criteria for bad law is if it comes up with is what we would see as an illogical or unfair result. And frankly, reading through the book and thinking about the situations and the advice being given, imagine the situation. You know there's a tunnel about to cross your territory. It's not there yet. And you ask the question, can I attack that tunnel? And you need to write 3 PhD theses just to understand the complexity of the question, because it raises questions of what we call jus ad bellum. Is that an act of war to destroy a tunnel, which is a preemptive destruction of tunnels? And we've had that discussion. It raises questions of proportionality because you have zero information about it. So how can you launch an attack when you have no information about the amount of potential civilians they're going to strike? All of these issues are so complicated that my friends in the International Law Department will share with you. You need to sit on them for a long time, have discussions, call American colleagues, come up with answers, and invent an answer which does not exist. So the reality is, international law on this type of questions has failed. It doesn't come up with clear, fair, reasonable answers. It comes up with a lot of questions. Everyone has been raising questions. I raise questions. So for me, the real result for me of reading this book and coming to this conference is the realization that we need to start working on this subject now, while we still have time, because it's just a question of time until we'll encounter some new questions we haven't thought of, thanks to Hamas and Hezbollah and others. And we have to come up with some clear, short, and implementable rules. I'll give you one example of a possible rule, and with this I will end. And I'm not saying I advocate this as the rule of international law. I want to show you how I think the rules should be. I think crossing an international boundary with an underground tunnel is an act of war. Just the act of crossing. And therefore, I personally would think it's reasonable to come up with a rule saying a tunnel in the situation of an armed conflict, which has crossed the border A, becomes an automatic military target, irrespective of what it is in the other side. And B, everyone in it is presumed a legitimate target unless proven otherwise. In other words, I would reverse the assumption of innocence and to the other side and say, if you are the target which crosses the border, I can target you. If you want to tell me that you're a civilian, tell me who you are and where you are, and we'll have that discussion. Now, this is not what international law says. In fact, to reach that result in international law, we need many more conferences like this and a lot of discussion. And I'm not sure we'll get there because I don't know if you know this, international law is divided generally into two groups. The pro-government and army groups, usually people like me who served, and the pro-human rights group, who are the other side of the coin, and we argue all the time, right? So the idea I just threw to you would be very attractive to people from my side of the equation. But if we don't have this discussion now, we will find ourselves in the next conflict putting commanders in a situation where they will have to come up with decisions and they won't know what they're allowed to do. They know what they want to do, but we, the lawyers and the commanders, won't really know what we're allowed to do in real time, and that is an unacceptable situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so, wow, that's a lot to talk about. Thank you very much to all three of you and to Agnieszka for your hard work ahead of this panel, for your insights. I wish we had this panel a couple years ago. That would have been extremely helpful. But still, as it's a work in progress, thank God, we can always improve and come up with better answers, right? Because all of the answers in the book are the wrong answers, right, Daniel? In any event. No, I got it. It's okay. So anyway, so I want to say a few things that have to do with what I called urban tunnels. So what is an urban tunnel in my view? How do I define it? It's either a tunnel that is dug in or near civilian populated areas, or a tunnel that is dug by civilians, or a tunnel that is dug to launch an attack specifically against civilians. So those are the three options. But now, here I kind of disagree with Daniel about something, because I don't think that historically there was this kind of interference or interface between tunnels and civilians. I think that what we're seeing today, where the trend of urban warfare is meeting the trend of underground warfare, is actually a new trend. Of course, we may find examples in which this happened, but I think that generally speaking, it's relatively new. The only example that I can think about where there were both fighters and civilians inside a tunnel in the past, historically, was in Vietnam, where women were giving birth in tunnels because it was not safe to give birth above ground. And so I haven't been to Vietnam, but I hear that when you go there, you actually see a reconstruction of women giving birth in tunnels. So that's true. But what I think is happening is that this meeting between urban warfare and underground warfare is magnifying a lot of the issues that exist already and that many in this room are familiar with that arise also in the context of urban warfare. And I think that's Daniel's point about comparing buildings to tunnels. But at the same time, so first of all, it magnifies these issues, it makes them even more difficult, even more complex, and the absence of information is definitely a fundamental aspect of this problem, of this enhanced dilemma. But there are also some issues that are new. And in fact, if I may, give a little teaser for the rest of the conference, tomorrow morning we'll have a panel which is entitled "What's Unique About Underground Warfare, If at All?", in which some of the themes that came up now about comparing tunnels to buildings and other aspects of weapons of war will come up again, and we'll be able to kind of deepen a little bit more analysis of that. So come tomorrow morning. Okay. So, but what I think is the trend is today different, is that what we're seeing is essentially the use of tunnels in war, the use of this tactic of war, which, like war in general, used to be confined to a strictly delineated geographical battlefield. And that's where you used to be able to find the tunnels, on the battlefield, the Battle of the Somme that John mentioned earlier this morning, by the tunnel mining. Where was this taking place? This was taking place on the battlefield. But today, where do you find these tunnels? You find them at the Syrian-Turkish border next to civilians. You find it in Sinjar in Iraq, and in Mosul in restaurants, and in Benghazi. And you find them, of course, coming close to civilian populated areas and kibbutzim in Israel. But I think that this trend will amplify. It will become more, the benefits that a terrorist group can reap from digging a tunnel in an urban setting are so much greater in a way than what they achieve in a non-urban setting. So I believe this is a new trend, and in fact the third category of urban tunnels that I mentioned, those that are dug specifically to launch attacks against civilians, there are not so many examples, I think, if at all. Even the Vietnam one that I mentioned before, the tunnels were not dug to attack civilians. So that, I think, is historically kind of a dissonance, right? It's like a historical dissonance between what we are anticipating to witness in the future, which is more of these kind of tunnels that will be used to maim and kill civilians, as opposed to how tunnels were used in the past. And by the way, one of the reasons it could be that international humanitarian law, right, that the laws of wars do not address tunnels at all, I should say, which is, I mean, it is surprising, but let's try to find some kind of rationale for that. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that tunnels, from time immemorial, as they were used in warfare, were only and exclusively used on the battlefield and against combatants as an anti-personnel tactic. So I'm not sure it gives a full answer, but it's some answer. Now, why should we be concerned about urban tunnels? Okay, and here I think there are some pointers that are giving us more information about what might be unique about tunnels in an urban setting. Why the concern? First of all, tunnels threaten the civilian population from the very moment that the digging begins until their complete elimination. So why is that? Because they create the risk of collapse, they create the risk of explosions, as explosives are being manipulated underground. As we know, many accidents happen because tunnels weaken the infrastructure. It's not always the best engineer who digs the tunnels, and they also may threaten water reservoirs. They may also cause damage to agriculture and the environment. So from the very moment that they exist, they start threatening the civilian population. I don't think that's the same situation with buildings, or with tanks, or with submarines, or with drones. I think that's unique. Until the moment they are fully eliminated. I think that even when they're filled with cement, by the way, they continue to constitute a security threat. Moreover, another thing that's unique about tunnels is that this threat is often intentional, since the people who dig the tunnels, they know about the presence of civilians. And therefore, as they dig it, they intentionally threaten the civilians near which or under which they dig the tunnels. And I think that's also different from other tactics of war or other weapons of war. And in the case of cross-border tunnels, it's even more mind-blowing. Why? Because in that case, if you're in a civilian-populated area, or a civilian-populated border area in this case, the cross-border tunnel essentially achieves the incredibly ironic outcome of threatening both the civilians on the side of that digs the tunnel and on the side that actually is the victim of the tunnel. So as the digger digs the tunnel, it's not only causing harm to the enemy, it is also intentionally putting in danger its own civilians. So ironically, the civilians on both sides of the conflict end up being subject to the same destiny and to the same proportionality risk, right, as the anti-tunnel operations will be taking place. So I think that these point to some of the unique features of tunnels that sets them apart from buildings and from drones and from tanks and from submarines and even, I would say, from nuclear bombs. Because nuclear bombs, if you are able to monitor, control the level of the explosion, they are supposed to hurt only the enemy. And here we have a tactic of war that has the potential of hurting actually both belligerents. Why else should we be worried about urban tunnels? And that has to do with something we call in international law state practice. If you look at how states have reacted to tunnel threats historically, it's not pretty. Historically speaking, states have deployed their most powerful weapons in order to fight tunnel warfare. Why? Because it's invisible. Why? Because it takes you by surprise. Why? Because it creates this fear of the unknown that is almost insurmountable, almost unbearable, and therefore better to just burn everything rather than have to do with a tunnel. And so that works. That works, for example, when the Soviets used the flamethrowers in the Afghan-Soviet war. It works, I think, much less when you're in civilian-populated areas and you use a B-52 bomber, or when you use chemical agents, or when the Egyptians use sewage water to eliminate the borders, the tunnels at their border that Hamas is digging. So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at how states have reacted to underground threats in the past, this state practice should really concern us. Because if that's how states are going to react to underground threats going forward, and that's going to happen in mega cities, that on one hand really concerns me and I think should concern us. But at the same time, we don't want to end up with bad answers. We don't want to put the military commander in a situation that he or she cannot make any decisions. We don't want to make tunnels untouchable. We don't want international law to give answers that are absurd or impossible to implement. So how do we deal with this? And that's really the question. I think that to some extent what we engaged in here in this conference and in the debate that we've been having for the past couple of months as we were planning this conference is part of the answer. Why? Because much of more importantly than finding the right answer, I believe, is to raise awareness about what it means to fight in an environment that has subterranean components. It may be that the entire conflict is not going on underground. That's actually the most realistic, probably, option. That it's the underground as well as above ground and as well as aerial warfare. It's part of something. It could even be also cyber. So it all comes together as kind of a multi-terrain, multi-dimensional conflict and military operations. But what is important is that when lawyers apply the law, whether it is judges or prosecutors or legal advisors, they are cognizant of what it means or how much the subterranean environment complicates the fight, from navigation to communication to rescue to equipment to doctrine. Every single aspect, I believe, and I'm not a military expert, but I believe that every single aspect of military operations is affected by the presence of tunnels. And it's only by saying that we will get the law to adapt. It's a slow process and it may take a long time, but it's, I think that's what we have to be aiming for. Not to change the law, but to try to get to the point where the law is interpreted in a way that makes sense given the reality. Let me give you an example. So I think it's very interesting that you looked inside the new doctrine that was issued, that is 150 pages, fantastic doctrine. In fact, I read it all, and I didn't think of looking for the legal references. It's very interesting. So I guess you only found one, and it was the one that you gave us. So, so that's very interesting, and it made me think of another example that I want to bring up. After Protective Edge, there was the Human Rights Council of the United Nations established a commission of inquiry to look into the legality of Israel's actions in Gaza. And there was a full report that was published. And in the report, there's this legal analysis about, the Israeli actions in Gaza. And from time to time, there is a reference to the fact that there were tunnels in the area. Okay. So then you would expect that slightly important fact to be then incorporated into the legal analysis, and what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. For example, there's a point where the UN report talks about the psychological harm that the tunnels cause to Israeli civilians, and that they reported that they were more worried about the tunnels than they were about missiles falling on them. All right, so how do we translate that into the legal analysis? That seems quite important. Well, at no point did the UN mission special report on Operation Protective Edge attempt even to try to translate that reality, that complex reality, which was mentioned as a factual thing, right? Oh, and by the way, there were tunnels there. Well, that's not good enough. We got to do better next time, right? So part of what I think we're trying to achieve is that we do get better next time. So we do have military doctrine now, and it's, maybe not perfect, but we'll talk about this more in the coming days. But now we need to get the law to kind of like catch up with that and find its own answers, which hopefully will be useful to military commanders and will be implementable. And one of the questions that I want to kind of piggyback here on Randy is, do we need to assume in certain circumstances that there are civilians in a tunnel? I think absolutely yes. Sometimes that must be the assumption. However, can we put the military commander in the impossible situation where we say, well, it depends on the information that you have available, yeah, and you need to keep looking for this information. Okay, but what if that information is not obtainable? And I think this goes back to what Daniel was saying, right? So we need to realize, and that's again about implementing the law, that when we apply these legal standards, there's got to be a point where we say, well, wait a second, we're not talking about regular or land warfare in general. We're talking about a situation where it's more difficult than usual to get this information. It might be even impossible. Yes, it's hard to get information about a building. In which room exactly the guy is planning the next terrorist attack. Fine, that's also hard. But eventually, you probably get it. But in the tunnel, you probably won't get it. So that, I think, is being cognizant of the reality. Now, I have to say in one word that I agree with your suggested rule, Daniel, and we can talk about it later. But I have some follow-up questions like, is it okay, is it enough if there's only one tunnel? Are you allowed to go on the territory of the other state or entity that has dug the tunnel in order, as a response to this act of war? So we can talk about this later, but generally speaking, I think we're on the same page, which is good. I would like to conclude with one more aspect that I mentioned briefly this morning, and that I think is important when we look at the title of the conference, which is called Subterranean Challenges in War and Peace. And you can take the same reality that we've described here, which is a reality that takes place on the theater of operations, and you can transplant it into a law enforcement counterterrorism context. And I think your pictures were incredibly telling in this way. The New York subway, the tunnels to keep the population warm in Canada, in Montreal, and in Toronto. What about all these tunnels? We talked about tunnel mining this morning. John gave us a full lecture on tunnel mining, and that's when I mentioned that I think this pre-existing civilian infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. It's vulnerable to tunnel mining. Why? Because it's so easy. You don't even have to dig the tunnel anymore. It's like you can just place the explosives and detonate. So that's very concerning, and that's very vulnerable. And that's kind of like, I think, what we need to think about at the more security policy standpoint. How do we deal with that threat? How do we address it? How do we prevent the next use of a pre-existing civilian infrastructure to launch an attack against civilians? So in my view, this qualifies as an urban tunnel. Anyway, I think my time is up, and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. So thank you very much to everyone for your attention, and to my distinguished panel for all of their insights.
Thank you very much. everyone on the panel. May I just add an example from 7/7 bombings in London that ended up on the subway as well, isn't it? So that takes us to the peace realm of relative peace. May I open the floor to any questions, please?
First of all, sorry, it's one of the 80%, about 70%. I will tell you, it was written for tactical commanders from the brigade level down to the battalion. Every brigade and every battalion has their own JAG-offs. Every mission is seen different. I totally agree with Colonel Reisner. It should be very simple because in a subterranean operation, the first thing you're going to lose is your comms. And now you have to rely on your lower soldiers, down to the lowest level to make decisions. If you make it too difficult, he's dead. So, and I also agree with you that there is not much difference between the subterranean environment, except for the type of facility, then you may need, it's resource intensive. But tactics, techniques, and procedures stay the same. We make it more difficult. The third thing I want to talk about is what is the distinction between a civilian and a military personnel? Because in the face of modern war today, the enemy and the civilian look the same because they hide. So I don't only say combatant and non-combatant. And what I distinguish and what I tell my soldiers is, if it's a threat to yourself and your fellow soldiers, then there's two things. It's either detained or it's dead. And that's it. I'm a soldier, I'm not a legal expert, that's why we didn't include that, because I let the JAG officers make their own opinions. We have to put information out as soon as possible, because General Milley wanted the brigades, the infantry brigades, combat brigades, to have this information. But again, you know, the JAG, the repercussions of the rules of engagement, that's based on each mission. So we're not going to put out something that's, you know, common to all, because they're not. Every mission is different.
So just real quick on that, you know, IHL is a framework. Rules of engagement are specific rules. And there's always this, when I was a JAG officer, I always sort of bounced between commanders wanting specific guidance and specific rules, but needing the flexibility to do the mission. When you look at IHL is based off basically 4 principles. For the United States, 5 principles. And those principles then guide whether you're an E5 leading a 4-man, you know, team, or you're a colonel with a brigade.
How many E5s know it?
It's when they start
How many E5s know them, sir?
Yeah,
They
no.
don't.
But when you start getting into rules of engagement, which are specific limitations that your country, for whatever reason, puts on you, then you're probably like every other soldier that hated it.
We'd be small enough for military personnel.
Yeah.
We say we do not shoot women and children. You have been situations where the enemy put a weapon in the hand of a child and said, go kill him. Does he become a combatant?
They do if they're taking direct participation in hostilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then, again, I ask, what's the distinction then? Why do we use civilian as a word to describe them? Because they all look the same.
Well, look, it's actually an area I've done a lot of
That's
detail
fine.
in. No, I'll be glad. I mean, how do you do it? They generally say they're civilians, and these days I would say fighters, because combatant is a legal term that they may not be. It implies a legal status. So civilians, and there are civilians that retain civilian status that they take a direct part in hostility, and for such time as they do that, they're targetable just like a fighter. And then there's those who come in groups that aren't combatants legally, but stay as fighters down the road. Let me get with you. I mean, I'll be glad. This is a great area I'd love to discuss. But what I don't want to do is tie up all the discussion time for this panel on that, if that's okay.
First of all, most militaries want to limit collateral damage as much as possible because of this little gadget here, which gets everybody in trouble. You know, the use of explosive underground is totally the dumbest thing you've ever heard of. Now, I've used explosive underground, and you cause more damage to the friendly forces than you ever do to the enemy itself. And the quality, the air quality, and there's many things, and overpressure, you can kill your own forces.
Sir, do you have a question? Because we have other questions waiting.
Sure, go for it. I'm just very passionate because I
just want to get more people
I've studied
from
the
the
military,
floor.
and I've actually done subterranean operations, just as some of our colleagues here. And I'm probably the only one in this audience that's ever dug a tunnel and used it.
No, maybe we can just finish his point and then we'll move on. So, Joe, what's the point of the explosives? I actually want
No, the explosive is that, first of everybody nowadays wants to limit collateral damage. Let's talk about a mega city. If you piss off the population, you have 1 million people pissed off at you that all of a sudden become combatants. And I know because I've been in a situation where we did not think about the population at all. We went in there, ready to just battle, and all of a sudden I had the whole city after me. So the first thing is just think about the population itself, what the population is needing, and then we can have a good information operations type campaign before we even go anywhere. I guarantee you limit about 50% of collateral damage and casualties.
I think we all agree on that. I think we couldn't agree more, actually. So that's great. Do you want to take more questions?
Nick Arboni from NBC. First, a comment. If I look to the future of warfare, I think most of the political science fiction movies and series today show that it will be underground. I mean, all the rebels, all the opposition to the system, to the governing forces and so on, are underground. In other undergrounds or grounds or something which is not penetrated by the forces which control the system. But the question is to John Spencer about the American army in Syria and Iraq. There were a lot of tunnels used in Mosul, in Syria a lot, much more. Did you interrogate the people which are prisoners now to understand who decided on the strategy, on the targets, for instance, the killing of the 4 intelligence heads of the Syrian army and so on? Is there information that you could use by interrogating a lot of people here?
That's pretty easy, but you won't like the answer. It's just not on unclassified level. So that's kind of the problem with our research in this topic. I deal only in unclassified. So you same thing with Daphne, showing the diffusion of information on how did it transfer from Hezbollah, Hamas tunnels into rapid use, daily use in Syria, then in Iraq, in the Philippines, and in multiple locations. How did that diffusion happen? Was there a memo sent out? So I can't answer your question because I can't get the information because that type of.
There is an effort because.
Yeah, no, for sure.
They know.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I actually wanted to hit on your science fiction thing, and not to be negative about a tunnel is similar to a building, and there are many attributes that are. And I agree with you in science. If you took this thread of armies advancing in their capabilities to strike above ground anything, you could see more going underground. Could you see full-out battles happening underground? And that's where I get into, and hopefully I'm not in any more panels, I promise, but on what makes the underground unique. You never know, not yet. What makes the underground unique, as opposed to, let's say I've been in urban combat, and the first time I had to go up to the 6th level of a building and have the possibility of fighting, it was very uncomfortable feeling. Because I had been psychologically engineered to be connected to my support, to recognize the human aspect of having control of an environment. All my training led me to that point to feel like control. And as I elevated in that building, I had a significant, overwhelming human response that this does not feel right. I have entered tunnels, and you can take that and put it on tenfold. But what sometimes science fiction will get is to this single soldier in a breathing apparatus, in a armored suit, by himself fighting. That is not the state of human psychology today. And that's where I think the tunnel diverges for me from other aspects of, even inside of a building, my human psychology of how people fight and pass through that fear or flight or flight. All that is designed in its historical, all of military. Once you shove me underground, I've lost all senses, sights. I can't. It is different. And I don't think we have scratched the surface, and Joe has worked this for 20 years. But to say, when we get to the point where we start having battles underground, you change every aspect of, I think, how people are able to fight a war, how soldiers are able to fight. When you sub them into an environment where I've lost all sense of control, I've lost most of my senses, and I can give you night vision, I can make you see down there. It is a very, very special environment. And there's good reason why we avoid it at all costs. And I want to continue to avoid it at all costs. I want to be able to seal tunnels so that I can just move on. But that's not the trend. But this science fiction, I think it may be the future of the underground. But we're going to have to significantly change a lot of aspects of how we fight psychologically underground.
Okay, so this is a very interesting panel, and thank you so much. Definitely a comment to you, but then I want to continue the discussion that Daniel started. My assumption is that and I have not researched it, is that from a historical perspective, this is really old. Just thinking about the ghettos in World War II and the Jews going underground the ghetto just to have the ultimate rebellion against, in the very few places where it's occurred, but I'm sure that but more than that, we didn't discuss at all the fact that tunnels are probably used by different states for intelligence purposes. You want someone to cross the border, but not on a plane, not in a recorded way. They just pass a tunnel and go to another country and disappear and start, moving from there. So then the question, and here's where I'm starting to question Daniel. Let's assume that we take your direction and we distinguish between cross-border tunnels and non-cross-border tunnels. Would you treat it differently when it comes to the question of when can you initiate an attack to defend yourself, and when it's wartime? Because, for example, I would assume that, let's assume I'm, in the building, I'm a citizen, I live in Gaza, and I'm in a 10-story building, and I'm aware that there is a tunnel under me, but, this is peacetime. But then there is a war, and I want to go underground, so I go to the tunnel where, they may have done it for attack purposes, but now they're not using it, but I'm going there because, with my baby. So would you treat it differently when you think about to prevent, and when you're part of the ongoing struggle? And maybe you will tell me that even during war, I want to distinguish between cross-border tunnels and other tunnels, and then you would apply different rules during wartime to tunnels, within Gaza and tunnels crossing to Israel. So I want to hear you.
First of all, I don't have a rule yet. I wanted to show you that we need to come up with them, and that the existing system doesn't give us answers. Now, to your specific question, and I gave this some thought. I can't say, I spent days on this, but for me, building a tunnel which crosses the border is a violation of sovereignty, and if you do it with intent to create military capability, is an act of war. Now, it's just like sending a car across the border. It doesn't mean you need to wage war because of one car. The difference between the tunnel, it stays there. So it's a perpetual violation, which is what makes it much more severe. Now, and the potential for abuse is constant unless you do something to stop it. Now, my instinct is to handle, I hate big rules. Because when I was responsible for implementing the big rules don't give you clear answers in specific situations. So I actually prefer simple rules for simple clear situations. So for me, I actually focused on the easiest question for me, which was if another country, in the context of an armed conflict, builds a tunnel crossing a border, that's an act of war. Now, what are the consequences? Anyone involved for me can die. I don't care who they are. If there's a civilian contractor, a military contractor, I am not required to make that distinction. If there is a tunnel where they blow it up, it's fine. 2, I can retaliate against that. In fact, under certain conditions of laws of war, that can be a casus belli, which can justify a military operation in response. Because remember, international law has a sequencing element. Some things can justify a self-defense response. Beyond a certain threshold, you're allowed to actually launch a military operation in defensive response, right? So for me, the simple answer is a cross-border tunnel in the context of a war or an armed conflict, if we talk about, for me, it's a relatively simple scenario. You went to the more difficult one. Let me try and go halfway there. If an enemy, forget the region we live in, builds an offensive tunnel which crosses the border, and then allows civilians to take refuge in it, then they are committing multiple war crimes, but that's not the issue I'm interested in. The way I would do it is to notify the population on the other side, which we are totally capable of doing. You should know that tunnels which cross borders are military objectives, and if you go into them, you will die. And then the woman with a child will just not go into that tunnel, and if she doesn't know and they're hiding from her the fact, she will ask the question before she goes, and she'll find another place to hide.
Daniel, if she's already in the tunnel, have you notified her?
I know. And she's collateral damage, and that's life. Now, I'm sorry, but one of the problems I face when advising on international law issues, international law is not about just saving civilians. International law is about finding the balance between the right of countries to protect themselves and use force and saving civilians. And that balancing act means that sometimes one has to give. Now, in this specific example, because Israel is on the receiving end of offensive tunnels, I can feel that side of the equation. If I was in another opposite direction, where tunnels would be used for defensive purposes, I would probably come up with rules about designating special defensive tunnels which are supposed to be safe from attack if you meet certain criteria. And there are ways to think about doing that. But again, as I say, I'd like to take it bite by bite and make sure we come up with a clear rule for each one of these situations. I'm not in favor of saying we have a general rule of targeting, a general rule of proportionality, and tell the military commander and good luck with it, because that's what we've been doing.
Can you envision a scenario where a cross-border tunnel would be treated by you as defensive?
Well, in the context of an armed conflict, no. In the context of an armed conflict, no. However, the realization that there are millions, thousands, I don't know, tunnels in the world for smuggling, for a million other purposes, means that I can't give a general answer. So the easiest question I could say is for a very small group. If you dig a tunnel in the context of an armed conflict which crosses the border, and you are one party to the conflict, I will assume that is a military tunnel. All the rest requires more thinking, but the end result of that thinking should be simple rules, not complicated.
Could we take both questions?
Okay. It's not a question, it's just a remark to the panelists. First of all, I want to thank you because the discussion has been very enriching. I come from NATO Allied Command Operations Office of Legal Affairs. It's in relation to the statement that Daphne Reisner has said regarding the raise of awareness of subterranean tunnels. I totally agree with you because when you have this kind of warfare tactics, states need to be completely aware of it. And I would add also an additional aspect that has been worked by our office in a paper that is going to be published very soon, and it's the aspect of resilience, of legal resilience. That is, resilience of the law, in the sense that states they need to fulfill with the international law, with the rules-based international order, in order to comply with international humanitarian law, the law of conflict, as maybe you want to know it, and you really need to use the tools that are available for an organization, like legal vigilance or legal awareness, or even target the behavior of an adversary that maybe can perform a behavior against you. So I would also emphasize that kind of aspect, especially because in NATO, and this is not a secret, this is public, we are really concerned about, well, and this is my opinion, my personal opinion, we are really concerned about hybrid threats, hybrid warfare, gray zone environments, and you don't really know sometimes when is the red line between international humanitarian law or law enforcement purposes. So I would also strengthen that capability, legal resilience, in order to know maybe where an non-state actor can attack you in such a way, and that's precisely the aspect that Colonel Daniel Reisner emphasized, that maybe international law doesn't provide answers to everything, but you have to really fulfill with the rules-based international law. So yes, sorry?
confession to make first. I'm a complete sci-fi geek. And an interesting point about sci-fi, but where some things have come to pass, many others haven't. Blade Runner came out in 1982, 37 years ago. We certainly don't have that dystopian urban environment portrayed in that video. Nevertheless, other things have come to pass. Interesting points about the doctrine and how that's being developed, and certainly how we frame that at a tactical operational level. I was privileged enough to be in the Italian Dolomites over the summer, and I was struck between the analogies between the military environment and the urban environment. John, you just said 6 floors up, thinking about how you would operate in that context, the psychological pressures of that, let alone being in the urban environment. And if you look at how the US developed the 10th Mountain Division in the Second World War for specifically that purpose, and how we, say, General Allied Forces go about training for this particular environment, maybe to tie into the doctrine aspect, the delegation of responsibility, the mission command aspects of that, notwithstanding the input from your legal advisors in whatever particular headquarters structure might be appropriate. Perhaps the question is generalist versus specialist. A generalist capability on the ground to have sufficient familiarity with the legal bounds within which they can operate, notwithstanding smartphones and the potential ramifications for that. And the mix of specialist expertise, and certainly in going into subterranean environment, I personally wouldn't want to be going in a conventional, this is a non-special forces context, without military working dogs, EOD and search, specialist engineer support, if I was an infantry officer. But I think that's broadly right across the whole urban environment, full stop. So we are looking at these hugely complex, contested environments with multiple layers, the civilian element, let alone the physical, the critical national infrastructure and the like. So, sorry, I'm slightly winded, but I guess the point comes down to training and the familiarity and the confidence with those troops who are on the ground to understand the environment that they're working.
I'll just say one word on that, because hearing John and hearing you speak, I just realized that when we send soldiers for underwater fighting, we have special units, SEALs, Shayetet in Israel. All countries have specialized units who are familiarized and trained ad nauseum to survive the unique environment. What we apparently have failed to realize, that underground warfare is more underwater than above ground. In other words, it has more and requires, I won't say a similar level, but some form of special training, understanding, familiarization, and preparation, because if you send the regular ground troops into an underground environment or to the 25th floor of a high-rise building, do not expect good results. And I think both of you have just said that.
Well, yes, to a certain extent, but I think that you can't, not everybody can be a specialist. So there still needs to be that underlying base level of...
Everyone has to know how to swim.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to argue this guy. So you're absolutely right. So we have been doing this in the U.S. military forces for a long time. But if you look at special forces versus conventional, most of what we've done is falls under the MUTWA, which is military operations other than war. Because MUTWA, military operations other than war. Because it's considered other than war, it never became doctrine because our training and doctrine command wouldn't accept it. So now what we have to do is they want us to train the regular forces, and we unclassified many of our TTPs in order to give it to the regular army. The problem is most militaries in the world create doctrine, TTPs, SOPs, and laws based on a reaction. We have not fought on the ground yet, except for some of our colleagues here. So therefore, it's the first time in the 200+ military history of the U.S. that we're trying to be proactive. So what is the matter with it? Nobody wants to do it because it's not something that we're tasked to do today. It's not finance. It's not an evaluated task, or we call it mission essential tasks. So it's not part of what officers and NCOs are not only trained on, but evaluated on. If there's no funding, if it's not a medal, if I'm not going to be graded on it, and it's not part of my evaluation, annual evaluation, I'm not gonna do it.
What about Vietnam and Iraq? You don't come to say, okay, you didn't do North Korea yet, but you did Vietnam and you did Iraq. And there were also some aspects in the NATO operation in Libya. So it has been
You
done.
have
It's just
special-
like
you
there's
have
no
specialized
insight and
units.
lesson learned is another issue. But it was done.
You have specialized units that went in Vietnam into the tunnels. I've been in those tunnels. I couldn't fit. So I was not part of that team. Iraq and Afghanistan, the special forces, we fought in caves, we fought in the Carezes. The rest of the army, it was secured by mess. They did not go in.
Yeah, so
Now, let me tell you something about you're not feeling familiar or comfortable with a 6-story building. In the U.S. Army, mount sites are only authorized at 3-story. Because they say if you fall with your equipment off the building off a 3-story, you may live. But if you fall off the 4th floor or 5th, you will die. Now, we have a 6-story embassy building in our training, and he had to fight, this man like next to me, Colonel Manning, had to fight in order to get approval. But believe it or not, that was the dumbest thing. It was, will a soldier survive a fall from a 3-story or 4th-story? And that's why, now the other thing is, when you go in and train in a mount site, an urban site for training, it's all blanks, and it's all gadgets, and it's a bullcrap, orchestrated fight. In the special forces, we go in there with live fire. So I feel very comfortable fighting in a 6, 7, 10-story building or more. I feel comfortable fighting on the ground. But we've done it with live fire, with live ammunition and explosives, and we know what we're doing. Now what we have to do is train the rest of the military forces to feel comfortable too, and get away from this risk assessment that nobody's willing to approve because it's my evaluation that's going to take place, and then I won't make a start.
So I know we're running over. For me, this goes back to that comment I said about force design. You have general purpose force, what we call the big military, and you have special forces, which are special. I argue, and I think Daphne argues, that subterranean has become such a commonality of modern battlefields. It needs to be a part of the general purpose force. And once you get there, you'll get to, that's when you get a requirement to some armies saying, this will be a part of the future of war, and we will develop general purpose doctrine, units, training events, the whole, what we call the .mil PF cert. Then you'll see challenge. Until then, me, regular Army guy, will be expected, it might happen, it's a special circumstance, adapt to it if you find it. That's different, and I think one of the reasons that this conference is being held is because we can listen to the modern battlefield or we cannot. It has to become something in the general military. Same thing for law enforcement, but I won't pull this on. Law enforcement is even challenged on the jurisdictional issues with going under the ground. It's still viewed as special. This is no longer special.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're digging into our coffee break. Let us continue